Hello, can I pluck up the courage to speak to myself very loudly in a room where people might hear through the walls? Yes, I'm completely insane. But not as much as this, The Passion of New Eve by Angela Carter, a book which actually made me feel quite nauseated, sometimes, only psychologically. And I've read American Psycho, so that's saying something. Passion of New Eve is by Angela Carter, who's a British writer best known for The Bloody Chamber, a short story collection, which is about fairy tales, which a lot of people have done for A level, but I've never done it, so it's my first experience with Angela Carter. The book is a feminist text, but at first it kind of reminded me of a female version of Thomas Pynchon because of all the weird happenings and the verbosity of language is very over the top in the way it's written, and it's quite exhilarating. The first few chapters, anyway, and I was really enjoying it at first, but it does get a bit much. A whole book, even though it's quite a short book, and towards the latter sections it changed. It was a bit more disturbing, if that's possible. The story is about a British man named Evelyn who goes to the United States to teach English, or it doesn't really mention that in the book, but I think I've read somewhere that was his subject. Anyway, he's a university professor, but because America's a kind of post-apocalyptic wasteland with racial and sexual groups kind of broken up and they're fighting each other, it's like a group of radical feminists and a group of blacks, because obviously back in the days of racism this book was written. They've kind of taken his university over, so he's destitute, and he goes on a trip into the desert, and it's not a spoiler because it says so on the back. He gets kidnapped by a cult of evil radical feminists who are led by a artificial goddess and gets turned into a woman. Yeah, you can tell it's a bit of a strange book. What I can say for it positively is that the language is phenomenal throughout the book. There is some great sections of incredible description. Even if it does sometimes get a bit far up its own arse, that kind of book always does, and it's not so bad when it's done well, and I think it's done fairly well here most of the time. Also, most of the concepts in here, you can't say it's not original. I mean, one of the characters is a one-legged, one-eyed poet who speaks mainly in growls, and there's a bust of Nietzsche in his office. I mean, he's the most extreme stereotype of masculinity possible. I've never seen anything like it. And you thought Sam Malone was a feminist caricature of men. Some of the symbolism in this book is fascinating. Mainly the stuff centred around this imaginary 1940s film star called Tristessa Decent-Ange. And when she retires, she lives in this massive glass house in the desert with glass tiers and a swimming pool. And it's a kind of mausoleum of her own construction. She's a kind of imaginary goddess of who's created her own image more than any real people, more so than Donald Trump. It's a study of how men see women. It's femininity from a masculine perspective, which does kind of make it more amazing how Angela Carter has written this. She's a woman and she manages to see how men see women, although maybe with a slight overly misogynistic tint towards all the men because people have bad opinions of us for some reason. Probably the main thing wrong with the book, and which did make me feel a bit uncomfortable, even though I suppose it can't really help that, is that because it was written in the 70s, it's got quite strange ideas about transgender people. It's always presented as quite mythological and really unusual, this man having a penis and this woman being transformed into another woman. Whereas nowadays, it's not quite as unusual, it's just an acceptable part of our society. And I suppose Angela Carter couldn't really help that, but a lot of books have aged better, especially since this is from the 70s, and I think books from the 19th century, most of them have aged better than this one. Not that I'm transgender, but it doesn't mean I can't be offended by poor representation. Another thing is that it's so relentless, the weird and disturbing happenings. There's a lot of rape scenes, for instance, a lot of death and murder and dismemberment. And I mean, I've got quite a strong stomach compared to most people. I was one of the people who found American Psycho funny rather than disturbing because it's just so over the top. But this book is actually quite nauseating in parts, mainly because it's so relentless. No individual section on its own is particularly disturbing any more than a lot of fiction these days. But because it's just keeps coming at you, you just like, can people just sit down, have a nice cup of tea, and a philosophical discussion like in the old days? Not that there isn't some philosophy in it, but it's all some weird nonsense about men representing time, and if you turn all men into women, time stops and everyone lives forever. I don't really know where she got that from, but not to spoil it, but the last few sections kind of are the worst. It kind of goes off the edge into a too far up its own arse, too weird and overly disconcerting. It kind of reminded me a bit of the ending of Interstellar, when most of the film had been a kind of gritty space drama, as far as you can get in a space drama, and then they suddenly had a interdimensional bookcase in space. It kind of reminded me a little bit of that, the ending of this book, and if you read it, you'll know what I mean, but if you don't, it's not a spoiler. It's just a complaint. Decent book. I would give it a C, probably, and that's being generous. I mean, I didn't particularly enjoy it, but I have to praise it for its originality. I was quite worried that it was just the Americans who had those kind of over the top weird books like Slaughterhouse 5 or Gravity's Rainbow, but turns out our books are even weirder in some instances. Obviously, there's J.G. Ballard. Yeah, I got it right. J.G. Ballard as well, and his books are really fucked up. I mean, you know about the car crash one. So we're out fucked up from the Americans. That doesn't make any sense. You know what I mean? Interesting book. I wouldn't read it again, but I would kind of recommend it because I think if I've warned you about the over-the-top nature and the nauseating violence and rape, you might go into it with those expectations, and then it'll feel less disturbing. Kind of like I did with American Psycho. If I hadn't gone into it with those expectations, I would have enjoyed it a lot less because I wouldn't have been quite as prepared for it. So read it and see what you think, even though it's really fucked up. But definitely worth the read.